That's after the third hour, the top of the third hour anyway, here on the Hugh Hewitt program. I had a conversation yesterday, in fact, with my friend Daniel Horowitz. Daniel is a senior editor at Conservative Review. And he is also the author of Stolen Sovereignty, a wonderful book called Stolen Sovereignty, How to Stop Unelected Judges from Transforming America. And we had a conversation about criminal justice reform. Why? Because the President of the United States is having a conversation about criminal justice reform. He is in favor of it, and Daniel is not. Joining us now to analyze is our friend from Conservative Review. He is the senior editor at Conservative Review. He is also an author of Stolen Sovereignty, How to Stop Unelected Judges from Transforming America. And Daniel Horowitz is also on CRTV. Good to have you back, Daniel. How are you, sir?
I'm doing all right. Make George Soros great again.
Yeah, nobody's talking about this component of this. Yesterday, the president made a big deal at his press conference and this announcement of his support for this First Steps Act. He made a big deal of saying bipartisan. Did anybody hear the word bipartisan? We just said we did something bipartisan. And it's being kind of phrased that way and framed that way, but nobody is talking about the fact that this entire program is a George Soros-sponsored event. Tell us more.
Sure. So first, I want to point your listeners to just a landing page we created at Conservative Review, Criminal Justice Reform or Jailbreak. Here's the truth. I've written about 50 articles on this, but there's about a dozen we whittled it down to. There's so many facets. We cover every facet of the actual legislation, other pieces of legislation that they have in store that they really believe in and are going to push, where the movement's coming from, where it's headed, the true trend of who is actually in federal prison, that really the sentences have gotten shorter, the crime is going up. There's a lot to say here. Obviously, everything in that speech was made up. The president has not read the bill, and I know that for a fact. You know that from the healthcare debate. He doesn't read bills. This is all coming from Jared Kushner, his liberal son-in-law. God bless the president for being close with family. I respect that. But, at the end of the day, we voted for Trump, not for his liberal daughter and son-in-law. And this is very near and dear to his heart. Jared's dad was a Democrat crook and was locked up in the joint in New Jersey, and he has a chip on his shoulder from that. Everyone knows that. It's reported in the media. And that's why he's been obsessed with it. Now, the thing is, whatever you think of white-collar crimes like his dad did, this bill has nothing to do with it. It retroactively early releases and reduces sentencing. So both front-end reduction of sentencing on the front end, back-end early time credit for the worst federal, this is going to be very important, not state, federal drug traffickers during the worst drug crisis imaginable, and gun felons, as well as others such as child pornographers, as long as it's only a first-time offense, not a second-time offense. This is a lack of understanding of the nature of who is in federal prison, what they're there for, and there's this talking point about racial inequality. You played the clip there. I have an article out, and I'm trying to find it here, which one it is, if I even have it in my list here, because there are just so many of them. The old Trump was right on crime and incarceration. And here are the following tweets. And by the way, everything I'm telling you now, everything I've written, Donald J. Trump has said that throughout his entire career. This is one of the most remarkable flips I've seen in my entire life. Trump has vacillated on a lot of issues, but not on this. His entire life, he said, these are violent felons. He actually just called for the death penalty of drug traffickers a couple of months ago. So, again, it shows how remarkable this movement is. He said that when it comes to violent crime, and if we are going to solve the problem, we must stop being so politically correct. We must tell it as it is. The overwhelming amount of violent crime in our major cities is committed by blacks and Hispanics, a tough subject to discuss. He said this in 2013. And he said, likewise, the primary victims of violent crimes are in African-American communities. Here's the reality. You could let out, and this is me talking, not Trump, you could let out every single drug trafficker in state and federal prison. And here's what will happen. Right now, blacks comprise 37.5% of the prison population. Now, they commit a much higher rate of violent crime. But right now, if you were to let them all out, it would go down from 37.5 to 37.1. In other words, they are there primarily for the four big categories murder, rape, armed robbery, and aggravated assault. And that which blacks are incarcerated that much is not because of the drug laws. That's the point. It's because of the violent crime. Here is fresh FBI statistics, just actually finished. 2017 data was reported in October of this year. There were 1,272 more black people who were killed by homicide than white people. That is astounding, given that they're only 13% of the population. Here's a better way to kind of conceptualize this.
Okay.
Even though blacks are just 13% of the population, they account for 54% of all homicide offenders and victims, 55% of robbery offenders, 33% of rape offenders, and 34% of assault offenders. So in other words, obviously the overwhelming majority of everyone, including African Americans, are hardworking, law-abiding people. Criminals are the minority. But among the criminal population, unfortunately, it is disproportionately African Americans, but also the victims are disproportionately African Americans. So by doing these jailbreak bills, you wind up you'll hurt the suburbs, but you'll hurt their communities even more.
That's precisely what I said before you came on in my last segment. You know, when the president says, we're going to undo this Clinton thing that locks up so many African, if you release all of these people, their victims are going to be, the people in their own communities who are 80 to 90% of their victims are the ones who are really going to suffer from this. In other words, you're not helping the black population by releasing criminals in this manner. You are hurting the black population because they are going to be victimized by these newly released people, and by those who aren't going to fear stronger sentencing guidelines or strong sentencing guidelines, because those are being weakened as well. Now, I want to clarify the other part of this. When you say, or when you quoted those statistics about 13% being black and committing 55% of the violent crimes, is the other 55 white, or is there a significant portion of that is Latino? And what is that demographic component of this? How does that factor into this law?
So this is very important. So again,
yes.
The statistics I gave you were the FBI's uniform crime reporting statistics that includes it's the entire country. It's important to understand that what we're talking about here is federal legislation dealing with the federal prison population. There's a number of things that this is probably the biggest lie, and there are many lies behind the Soros movement. The federal prison population is unique in about 5 different ways. Number one, most broadly, only 10% of the entire national prison population is in federal prison, right? 90% is in the states. We only have about 176,000 in federal prison. So when you see this big number of 1 million, 2 million, that's in the states. The federal prison population is not that big. It's gone down 20, 30% over the last decade. It's gone down in raw numbers, much less the rate, even with the population growing. A couple other things. Only 12% wind up completing the mandatories. There's multiple avenues called the safety valve, and more than ever, they're getting it. They've been getting it. This is a big lie. They're being let out more than ever, and incidentally, crime is going up a lot of places, and the drug trafficking is going nuts. But I digress.
Shocking, right?
Exactly. Another important component, getting back to your point about Latinos, 2 other things about the nature of the federal system. The federal system, let me tell you something. Federal prosecutors will only go after someone in the federal system if they're really bad dudes. It's kind of like a backstop from the state system. Let me give you a perfect example of what's sitting in federal prison. Really, we need criminal justice reform the other way. Reagan used that term to say that too many people escape prosecution. We have too many violent crimes that go uncleared, and I could go through the numbers. They're astounding. So we fundamentally have an under-incarceration problem. If you just look at the violent crime categories that everyone agrees need to be locked up. But what happens is that, they often escape justice because it's so doggone hard to land a conviction, not because of the baseline due process, but the BS due process added on by the courts, the evidentiary standards, they taint the evidence, this gets thrown out. It is so hard.
Question. And this is why we're talking about the criminal justice reform first step program being endorsed in advance by the president this week with bipartisan support in Congress. Democrats, Republicans alike, really, really excited about this. Daniel Horowitz, not so much, myself included. And I want to ask Daniel this about the reason reason why so many of these people are in these federal prisons. It is perceived to be about drugs and nonviolent crimes. But it's not about drugs. It's about the crimes committed, violent crimes committed by many of those who cannot be locked up for their drug crimes that are locked up for other reasons, including...
So, for example, Kate Steinle's murderer. We all know he murdered the girl, but what happened was California's a dumpster fire. He escaped justice. Sessions came in, and DOJ hit him up on what? Immigration charges and gun charges. So you're going to see him serving a hard time, and you're like, oh, a gun felon, like, wow, why is he in there that long? But really, they only went after him because of his history. There's something called a sentencing report that a judge uses. He looks at his complete rap sheet, his history. And what this bill does is, so they say, oh, it's first-time offenders. It's a big lie. It expands the safety valve for those that have 6 prior convictions. These are career criminals. And one other thing in there is most of them, not most, but a lot of them are foreign nationals. When you start talking about federal drug charges and sitting in federal facilities, why are they in the federal system and not state system? Often it's because their immigration status. It's an immigration problem. In Lawrence, Massachusetts, they just busted 40, 50 of these dudes, enough fentanyl to kill the entire Massachusetts. Every name, to my knowledge, was a foreign national. This is an external problem at a primary trafficking level. It's a sanctuary problem. It's a border problem. Do the 25 or so things we want in immigration, then come back to me if we have this problem. 38% of those who are in U.S. Marshals custody, meaning you're awaiting trial in the federal system, are foreign nationals. I could only imagine what that number is. I don't have it. Divided by those in custody for drug charges.
Right. Daniel,
mainly a foreign national problem. They all have Hispanic names.
Daniel, I've got to wrap here, but before I do briefly, is this why Jeff Sessions was fired?
Wow,
Jeff Sessions completely opposed this First Steps Act and this prison reform and everything else that's going on. He survived all of the president's complaints about Russia, this, that, and the other thing, and his inactivity. But I feel as though, this isn't coincidental that just a few days after he announces Jeff Sessions is gone, boom, here comes the prison reform that Sessions absolutely would not go along with.
You are good, and I could confirm with you. So first of all, as you well know, DOJ and the Bureau of Prisons wrote a whole manifesto on this. I barely scraped 2%. There's a tremendous amount of logistical problems with this bill, with community supervision and halfway houses. There's a lot of insane things in this bill. It allows illegal aliens to go into home confinement, and they're just going to escape. But basically, Jeff Sessions, look, it was because of Mueller, Trump hated him, and the relationship never recovered. But what happened was once he lost favor, Jared and the Koch brothers and all of the masters of the universe in the D.C. swamp, and I mean all of them that are supporting this, and this is the number one swamp issue, believe it or not, they gunned for him. So you are very astute. That was a big part of it. And this ties in into the future, looking for a new replacement. That is one of the big things Jared is looking for, and that's why Chris Christie, if you remember, he met with Jared to potentially be vetted for AG, and he started talking about criminal justice reform. It ain't a coincidence.
Boom. Yeah, that's exactly right. Daniel Horowitz, I'll be reaching back out to you to get some of those stats so that I can study those a little bit more, that you've put up, those federal stats and more. But thank you so much for the time today. I appreciate you shining a spotlight on this for us.
Take care. God bless.
Daniel Horowitz, one of the very best in the business. Quite frankly, he's a brilliant man. He is all over this. The crime statistics that he was mentioning, I have in front of me as well. As he pointed out, this jailbreak reform bill, this prison reform bill, this sentencing reform bill, this criminal justice reform bill called First Step that he is talking about, it will have absolutely no positive impact in the communities that the president himself said it was designed to help and designed to serve. The people who will be victimized by the increase in crime in these communities will be of the same race that he is trying to help protect by releasing and opening the jail cell doors. The criminal justice system does need reform. This is a horrible way to do it. He's listening to his liberal son-in-law, Jared Kushner, instead of those who actually understand it, like former AG Jeff Sessions. More coming up on the Hugh Hewitt Show.